Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, North America's first place city. And in this set of episodes, we've been talking about the historic cemeteries with which our city is so blessed, St. Michael's, St. John's, and of course, Barrancas National Cemetery as well. And in our first episode, we talked a great deal about the background of how a cemetery was established here in the first place, how the Spanish government became involved, how that cemetery, St. Michael's, became the ward of the Catholic Church. And we talked a little bit then about what went into the cemetery itself, how it was organized, and then some of the funerary customs that developed over the course of the 19th century. We've, of course, concentrated thus far specifically on St. Michael's because, of course, it was first. One or two more things, of course, need to be added about customs in dealing with death and burial. One of these elements, of course, has been music. Now, music has varied tremendously in Pensacola, depending upon the type of funeral involved. Many times, of course, there was no music at all. Sometimes when the funeral service basically was held in the family home, a choir from the church or a small choir group might have been involved. The idea of use of hymns, and in a very few cases, this was particularly when prominent citizens were buried, had their funeral service in St. Michael's Church. Some of the Requiem Mass material by Mozart and others would have been used, particularly early in the 20th century. One of the more unique services of that kind was conducted in the Presbyterian Church just a few years ago, when a man named Oliver Leonard, who had for many years had conducted the barbershop society here, for his funeral, an entire barbershop chorus was in the balcony of the church, and their rendering of appropriate music was a very stirring affair that brought tears to many eyes. Now, in St. Michael's itself, there are, as one views the area, walking back and forth across it, one finds quite different effects in some of the burial plots, because, of course, many of these are devoted to family burials in concert. One of the earliest ones was of the Brosenham family, and they utilized two different activities, two different methods of marking the family plot. One, of course, was the conventional fence. Now, the idea of using a wrought iron fence around the plot became fairly fashionable in the late 1920s, or 1820s and 30s, and you'll find that in several places throughout this cemetery. Then the Brosenham family, and some others, of course, did the same thing. They literally covered the entire area. Once the burials had been completed there, they covered the entire area with concrete. And I assume they did that so that there was not the problem of maintenance that would occurred there afterward. Now, we have a number of very, very prominent people of the 19th century, of course, who are buried in St. Michael's. And just to mention just a few of them. The Cummins family, the Brent family, the Brosenhams, the Sierras, the Sullivans, and then, of course, Stephen R. Mallory. And let me mention just a couple of these now, because as one makes a visit there, their burial sites are so significant. The Sullivan brothers, of course, were very prominent bankers. They were the ones who developed the Opera House, and one of them, of course, was one of the two figures that were involved in creating the Alger Sullivan Lumber Company up in Century. When the first brother died, his name was Daniel. When he died, the family erected a huge monument right in the very center of the cemetery. It was a huge, and at the very top of that was affixed a 6-foot-high concrete cross. Unfortunately, the cross was lost in a storm one time, so that has never been replaced. But the balance of the Sullivan monument is right as it was placed in originally, and of course, it too is surrounded by a wrought iron fence. There's one story about this, that particular monument and burial customs that is so significant, so interesting the way we do things. Back in the 1880s and 90s, perhaps even a little earlier that, the widow of Daniel Sullivan used to come to the cemetery on All Saints' Day. This was a common practice then because many families came to place flowers on graves and to pay homage to those who were buried there. Mrs. Sullivan literally came there with a servant and with, of course, course, appropriate chairs, and she sat there and received visitors who came to pay a call and to remember the memory of her husband. And Mrs. Sullivan became quite famous for that over the years. Another site that is interesting to visit to today. This is in the northeast corner of the cemetery, and it is the burial place of Stephen Russell Mallory, the man who was the Confederate Secretary of the Navy during the Civil War, and who later on, of course, was a prominent attorney here until his death in 1873. Mr. Mallory's burial place is very nicely done, and it's unique in this way. There is a flagstaff in that burial site. And if things are going properly, and they usually are, the flag on that staff is alternated day by day, so that on one day there will be an American flag, and then on the second day will be a flag of the Confederacy, so that people who pay homage to the many roles that this man had for our country or his country, basically they can do that there. Once again, throughout this cemetery, you will find all sorts of other unique burial elements. We have here the only place in the cemetery where there are steel or iron, I should say, not steel, but iron grave markers. This was the iron grave marker was a very common thing in British cemeteries, and this particular these markers are for British seamen who were here and died of yellow fever, of all things, and they're marked right together. You will find also, as you go from place to place, you'll find that there are markers of whole families who died at almost the same time, and of course they were the victims of yellow fever, and we find that on several different occasions, particularly in the 1850s, and then there is another sequence of them early in the 1880s. Now, all of this, of course, makes for a beautiful cemetery, and right in the very center of it, or just off the center of it, is another very unique area. It's a mound, a large, it's a small hill actually, and this is called the Priest's Mound. And in that mound are buried 5 men who were priests at St. Michael's Church, and they had no family ties anywhere else, and consequently they were laid to rest there with an appropriate ceremony and a marker that shows who these men. This goes back a good ways. And to this day, depending on who the chief priest will be at St. Michael's, on All Saints' Day, they still have a very fine ceremony there. I can remember one not too many years ago when Father Bowles was the priest at St. Michael's. I can remember meeting him out there. We were doing some filming in the cemetery, and he was there literally laying out the red carpet which people would come across to the site where he was going to have service that next afternoon. So the cemetery is a beautiful place, a wonderful place to visit, to see, to understand the past, and it also has a problem, and we're going to address the problem a little bit in conjunction with both ceremonies, but both cemeteries. But actually, St. Michael's probably should deserve more attention on this. The cemetery, of course, as we've mentioned before, was established in 1808. In 1897. The man who was then about to become the city's mayor, Charles Bliss, was publishing a beautiful magazine about the size of the National Geographic, which he called the Bliss Quarterly. And in that particular issue, in the summer and the winter issue of 1897, is a story about St. Michael's. It gives all of its background, a number of wonderful pictures, including the Sullivan Monument. But the article is very critical, because even back then they were having problems of vandalism, and then the question always came to the fore: who is going to maintain the cemetery? Who's going to take care of the weeds and making sure that the memorials are kept in place? This was a problem over 100 years ago, and of course we're lucky that in the 21st century that is being well addressed, but nonetheless the problem has been there for a long time. Well, now, next, let me turn the page just a little bit and turn to our other historic cemetery, which of course is St. John's. St. John's came into being in the middle of the 1870s. This is the time when the city was just beginning its boom era. This is the lumbering era, the fishing era, naval stores era, the railroad times. And by that time, the city itself in population had grown from about 2,500 right after the war itself. And by the time we reached the middle 70s, we were approaching 6,000 to 7,000 people here. And at this time, and this is something that I guess very difficult for us to appreciate in the 21st century, at this time there was some very strong feeling dealings between Protestant and Catholic communities here within the city. And as a consequence, the Masonic order, which was growing very substantially in that time, the Masons felt they were not comfortable in asking their members to be buried in St. Michael's. In addition to that, of course, St. Michael's was beginning to be just a little on the crowded side because its 8 acres had been in use now for better than 70 years. And so the Masons came together and they worked with the city council. And they obtained a plot of ground, 28 acres on the west side. We could use 2 streets as guideposts for this. There's G Street and Belmont Street. And the Masons obtained this plot, laid it out, got all of the proper rulings from the state, and the first burial was conducted there in 1876 in August. Now, what the Masons did was very practical. As they laid out the cemetery, it was done with a geometric proportion, if you will, with lots very neatly laid out by section and by side. And right at the very front, as one came through the gate, there was a section to the left-hand side as one was moving west, which was laid out specifically for maritime people. Because in the 1870s, we were beginning to see people who were here on sailing ships who had accidents, so forth. So they wanted to have a place where these people, who of course were very far from home and were given a final resting place, they wanted to have something special for them. And that was provided, and of course it is still there and in use today. Alongside of this was a place especially for infants. Now, once again, it's kind of hard for us in the 21st century to appreciate that, but the infant mortality back in those days was very high. Plus, the city was facing the unfortunate situation of having a sizable number of abandoned children, and many times these children their lives were short. And of course, the Masons said, "Well, we've got to provide a Christian element for them," and a site was laid out for this. There was also a special section for any Masons who might happen to be in Pensacola when they passed away, and they would be given a free burial spot right here in the Masonic Cemetery. So they were ready to go. Then in 1876, the cemetery opened. And bear in mind, now this was literally owned by the Masonic order here at that time. And so they began to proceed. Now, what is interesting in a comparison of St. Michael's to St. John's is this. Most, not all, but most of the people who are buried in St. Michael's were prominent in the early to mid years of the 19th century. The ones that we find in the St. John Cemetery are people whose lifespan begins roughly at the time of the war between the states, and then of course extends over right to the day in the 21st century. The cemetery is still very active as far as burials today. So basically the cemetery begins to be laid out, and as they did so, we now begin to see something else. We find people who are and we can categorize by what they did and who they were. And here we have many of the people who were at the head of such things as the medical profession, the education profession, leaders in government, leaders in the military. These are people who are there. Of course, they're not segregated in that way, but they are there and are men and women who were absolutely the leaders of our community then. Now, in addition to that, we find many different little segments of the cemetery that are, while they are not specifically labeled this way, they illustrate the presence there of different ethnic groups. Where we have German, we have French, we have certainly even Slovakian, we have Italian. All of these people who preferred to be buried together because of their ethnic backgrounds, and of course, once again, there are family plots for all of these. Now, St. John Cemetery is organized in such a way that people can visit it easily, and we will come back to this again in the next episode. But as we are doing this episode today, a group called the Friends of St. John are literally putting together the entire story of who is buried there and where they are in a computer model, so that people can go there and can find relatives or friends who out of the past. So we'll continue this story in episode 3.